welcome. We're going to look at in this video we're going to look at actually writing a feature article and how to go about the process of writing a feature article if you are asked to write one as opposed to an essay. Now they're often introduced in exam questions in just that way instead of an essay. And the reason for that is they want you to be able to apply your knowledge, apply what you would normally write in an essay into a different format where you have to use more personal expression, where you have to vary your writing style, and ultimately it means that you'll probably come up with a different sort of response as well. So we're going to look at how to do that and the best way to go about writing one. And it pretty much does follow everything that you would have seen if you've watched the other videos on feature article, but even still, the one thing that you really do need to focus on is how to actually get your point across using that style and the best way to do that. We'll also look at how to write an effective feature article and how to apply them to a question. Okay, so it's one thing to actually be able to write one, but it's another thing to actually apply one to a question as well. All right, because it's not just going to say write a feature article, it's going to have it to do with a particular aspect of the text or of the stimulus that you've been given. So when you're asked to write one for a question, you need to obviously tailor your response so you're answering the question at the same time, much like you would do if you're doing an essay. Okay, so to start with, a feature article usually has a short and punchier opening. So when you're starting off, you need to be mindful of that. You're not writing an essay introduction. You're writing an introduction which is more direct and straight to the point. You pretty much should do the same. You don't introduce your argument, you just go straight into it. Okay, so you don't need to outline your points like you would for an essay. You can pretty much go straight in the middle of it. And because one of the qualities of a feature article is it does sort of carry on with the same argument throughout the whole thing, you can pretty much start with it from the beginning and then elaborate on it as you go along. You also include your related text if necessary. So if you're asked to discuss a text, then that is what you do. And you pretty much can do it in a natural style. Instead of saying in blah, 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 you can sort of link it with your argument to say that these feelings, such as those expressed in so-and-so's story, are reminders of how we should be feeling. So you can actually introduce it in a natural sort of way as well. All right. The next point is argument, and the argument, particularly in a feature article, is a direct and personal one, which means as opposed to what you would be doing if you're writing something for an essay. Yes, an essay is direct, but the one thing about it is it's not personal. It's an impersonal argument. You're using not only details from the text, but you're constructing it in such a way where your opinion is there, but it's not associated with it. So what I mean by that is that you would use I and you would use you, and you would direct it directly towards the audience. So when I say direct as well, it is a little bit more direct in the sense that you are providing information and you're talking directly to someone, as opposed to just being very direct and to the point. And the personal argument means that you can actually have a bit of fun with it, and you can actually play around with the points that you express, and certainly the way that you express them. You can have an opinion. You can say if something was done well or done poorly. You can even lay into the story if you hate it so much. Mind you, you still need to obviously answer the question as well, but you can be very personal about it. You can use a variety of sources, and if you do get a little bit of time to prepare, look at some different kinds of sources that you can use to sort of substantiate what it is that you've said. And don't just think about quotes. Think about using, for instance, the opinion of another author or another writer who's actually written about the text, that, for instance, that you've been studying. Use that as an additional text. Use another additional text as well. Use it as another perspective and use it as another way to layer your argument. You don't always have to go straight for quotes from the text or quotes from the second text. You can actually just talk about them in a very natural way. Discussion is the most important aspect, all right, because your personal opinion must be directed. Now, what I mean by personal opinion directed, and why I've got it highlighted in these big yellow letters here, is because one of the greatest weaknesses, and this is actually what makes feature articles harder to write than an essay, is because with extra freedom means there's extra room for you to go wrong. If you have to keep your opinion directed, it means that it's much easier to go off on tangents. And it's obviously one of those things that everyone does when they go on to a little bit of a spiel. They'll go on to different tangents and they'll go off topic. And it's very hard to rein yourself back in again once you've done that. So you need to be constantly mindful that every point that you raise is related to the question and related to the text, obviously, that you're writing about. You need to also use those sources to back up what you say. So use it as a way of supporting what it is. So rather than you just spreading your opinion, and you can do a lot more than obviously what you would do in an essay. In an essay, you need to direct it towards discussion and evidence. You need to have those fairly even. In a feature article, you can weigh a lot more on the side of personal opinion and obviously discussion as well, provided, of course, that you are specific. Now, the point about being specific is that you're talking about things directly rather than sort of waffling on and skirting around what the main points are. You can paraphrase, you can talk about incidents in the text directly without necessarily having to quote them. And particularly if you're discussing an event in a play, for instance. So let's say I'm discussing Hamlet and you're talking about the to be or not to be monologue. You can talk about just that monologue as a paraphrase, as in you talk about what it's actually referring to rather than quoting a big large slab of it and saying, well, this is what it means. Because ultimately, and if you look at any newspaper, feature article, they don't do that. They don't grab large quotes unless it has something really important to say that the journalist in question or the writer in question can't put forward themselves. So they don't do that. They will actually just talk about very specifically. They'll talk about specifically what it's about and don't sort of go, well, it's about, this happening and that happening, and in the end he does this, because that's not really getting to the point. Okay, sequencing is also another big issue in feature article writing. It's one of the things you also have to be really mindful of. Now, when I say that sequencing is really essential, first of all, yes, it will link your ideas and arguments together. But the other thing is you also get freedom with this, unlike you probably get with an essay. Whereas an essay, you need to link your ideas by paragraphs, and that each idea is represented through an entire paragraph. Okay? And then, you may spread it for, if you've got a couple of similar points on the same topic, yes, you can spread them across a couple of paragraphs. Of course, in a feature article, you'll often only have maybe one, perhaps two arguments. And you need to sustain those, and your length and your sequencing needs to reflect how you sustain that argument. It doesn't have to be in order. You don't have to talk about the text in order. You can talk about it in terms of your ideas. You can start and finish as well with a powerful statement. So rather than your body being the be-all and end-all, you can actually use your introduction and your conclusion. Mind you, I wouldn't leave your biggest point to your conclusion. I would start that in the introduction and then wrap it up properly in the conclusion rather than start something new, because obviously you won't be able to elaborate on that. So your introduction is very important and your opening is very important. And the rest of your sequencing should carry on that good work from your opening and continue it going. Unlike an essay as well, you need to organize ideas without a formal structure available, as I mentioned before. So because you get a bit of freedom, you need to also practice that skill of actually organizing things without having an essay format to do it for you. It's one of the things about essays that actually makes it very easy, is that the format's predetermined and you have to pretty much organize it in a certain way. With a feature article, you don't have to organize it in that way, and you can pretty much carry on with your argument however you want. However, you don't want to be leaving it to halfway, and you don't want to be certainly leaving it towards the end to come up with your best point, and certainly you don't want your argument to start achieving some merit then. And an entire article can be on one argument, as I mentioned, where you develop detail and insight. Now, those two words are essentially what you'd be looking for from a feature article. First of all, detail. All right, so as I said before, specifics. You need to be really specific with what you're actually saying. You need to talk about the text directly. You need to use and apply your knowledge of a text or of a subject. You can't just sort of waffle around. You need to get directly to the point. The other thing as well is insight. Now, insight means that you actually think a little bit carefully about it, and ultimately your argument should be trying to develop some sort of insight. Now, that's also true of an essay. You should be trying to do those things too. But because you've got one argument in this case, or maybe two, you've got less arguments and you've got more of a sustained sort of arc and structure, this means this is a lot more important because you may only get one real shot of actually developing a very strong point. So in that case, you need to really develop detail and insight from the very beginning, and you need to have a really strong argument. If you don't, then chances are then if you don't get it right from the start, you won't get it right towards the end. Okay. Now language is also an area where you get a little bit more freedom, and it's a mixture between formal and colloquial. You could call it conversational, but again, that is more of a sort of a colloquial style. It's obviously not slang, and you wouldn't use a slang expression or use an expression where you are cutting out letters and words and all the rest. You would try and focus on making it a point about entertainment as much as you would about arguing a point. And what I mean by that is that you actually do try and make your feature article entertaining. It's not an essay. You don't have to state facts and do it in a very boring and dry way like you do with an essay. You can actually be a little bit creative with how you write it. And you can discuss it in a multitude of different ways. Ultimately, yes, the goal is to try and get your point across. But if you do actually try and add a little bit of life and a bit of humor to it, then you're going to find that first of all, your point comes across a lot more easily because you're actually discussing in a natural way, and it means that you're not laboring it and you're not trying to just go from one quote to the next. You're actually discussing it. That's the first thing that you do. And the second point is, of course, if you're actually entertaining your market, they're more likely to really pay attention to the things that you're saying, and ultimately you get a better mark out of it. So that's one of the things that you can really get, particularly if you focus on really entertaining as much as you are arguing a point. Obviously, answering a question, arguing the point is number one, always number one. But try and add some humor and some life into it as well. If anything, it would mean that the market will thank you for not having the most boring feature article in the world. And also, you should try balance writing freely and expressively. So you need to, first of all, be able to write in that sort of that conversational style, but you also need to be able to do it at the same time of communicating your ideas. In other words, you can't be too clever. You can't spend too much time entertaining, because if you do that, obviously your argument's going to go missing. So you need to have a balance between that, and it's just about setting up the right balance between what you get out of telling us your ideas, telling us your structure, and also by being a little bit expressive and free of how you describe things. You must, of course, stick to the question, as it's fairly obvious you have to do that for any task you are given. Okay, so we've got pretty much there a sort of a style of language where you can pretty much talk freely, as you would if you're talking to your friends. Of course, the one thing that you do have to be very mindful of is to avoid particularly slang. And one thing that I always say to students, particularly if they do get an opportunity to write something colloquial, is remember that the average age of a teacher is roughly in the 50s. So if you use an expression that it may be doubtful that they've heard of before, yes, okay, most of them are practicing teachers and they will probably would have heard of it, but if you use an expression that they don't really like or they don't really know the meaning of, chances are they're not really going to understand what you're saying. So you write it in a style where other people will be able to understand it, not just you and your friends, because it's one of those things. You have to sort of bear in mind who's marking it, and who's marking it is usually quite important. Okay, audience engagement. Now, it's like a speech. You need to basically be able to, first of all, have a conversation, speak directly to the target audience, but do so in such a way where you're almost doing it like a speech. And as I said, a speech and a feature article are actually quite similar. And the main sense for that is that they're both mediums which require a lot of audience engagement. And it's also inclusive of the audience. You're not talking at them. You're not saying that they should do this and they should do that. You're saying that we should do this, you should do that. Okay, so you're not talking at them, you're talking to them. You're telling them something that makes sense on not just you standing on your soapbox and saying that we should do this, we should do that, because everyone's going to go, well, yeah, of course. But if there's actually some ways that it can be connected to the readers, ones who will actually go, oh, well, yes, we can do that, then obviously it's going to have more an effect than if you're just standing there ranting and raving. Speak, as I said, like a speech rather than an essay, because an essay is not very good for audience engagement. In fact, an essay should not engage with an audience whatsoever. So if you have pre-prepared an essay, if you are one of those people who do that, I really don't recommend you don't, but if you are one of those people who do that, then one of the things you've got to be very mindful of if you are asked to write a feature article instead is making sure you do connect it back to your audience again. Okay, so actually speak to your readers, speak to them, talk to them, have a conversation with them, because that's ultimately what you're trying to do. You also need to make it interesting, as I mentioned before, if only for your marker, because let's face it, markers have to mark a lot of papers, and if you get one in an exam or even as an assignment, then you want to make it something interesting. Okay, so finally your conclusion. Now your conclusion again is not quite as important as your opening, but it is still fairly important. It needs to be powerful and it needs to tie the beginning of the article to the end. So if you make a throwaway line in the beginning, might be nice to have a punchline at the end. You need to make it circular. So as in you've basically proved all of your ideas, all of your points by the time you get to the very end of the circle. And that is basically, by the end, you should be able to relate the two together. That's all you have to be able to do. So if you've got an expression or something at the beginning, something that maybe even if you've used a famous quote, you wouldn't use one for an essay, but you're more than welcome to use one for a feature article, then you'll be able to answer it, throw in a punchline, do what a lot of feature article writers do, and that's what they often do, is they'll start with this idea, and then they'll actually discuss how it's relevant to the issue they're discussing, and then they'll conclude with something that sort of goes back to that beginning or has a punchline that the reader's going to look at and smirk and go, oh yeah, fair enough. So it's one of the things that, again, you're trying to do. So in summary, you need to have a powerful intro and conclusion. They are the things that sell your argument to your readers. You need to use language expressively. Don't write an essay. Please don't write an essay. I'm going to say it for the final time. Please don't write an essay. And concentrate on delivering personal opinion. So again, it's one of those aspects that we've been through where you really need to make sure that it's not just writing of a very boring and stagnant piece, that you actually do try and make it interesting and you make it personal as well. But otherwise, that's it for feature articles and how to write them. I wish you the best of luck, and until next time, I'll see you later.